at the core of Project 2025. How can you concentrate power and disenfranchise the different branches of government so that the only functional branch is the president? They were playing on people's like ignorance or people's nationalistic sentiments a lot more, which is what you get in like very populist governments and regimes around the world, the kind of governments that America then wants to like free their people from. America will say like, we're going to go to war to bring democracy to these countries that are under authoritarian or dictatorial leaderships. And that's kind of where people are seeing America now.
Whether or not the American empire falls, the American machine is still all about exporting and imposing and like forcing their beliefs, their ethics, their desires onto other nations internationally. Welcome back to Sage Takes Time. I'm Elissa.
And I'm Amira.
And today we're gonna talk about
global politics, how the far-right resurgence in the US
and globally
is affecting the world and reactions to that in different parts of the world, and the plans for women and families and all these things under a very, very ultra hyper conservative super red Republican Party in full control of all three branches of government and maybe never leaving office. Don't forget to turn on notifications.
Bravo. To make sure you stay in touch with everything that Womena's putting out and stay informed so that you are at least entertained and aware whilst your rights are being taken away from you.
We're okay. We talked about this last season. We started talking about, at the time it was gearing up for the US election when we were filming, and by the time the episode came out, it was the actual results of the election had been announced, unfortunately. And like many people predicted, despite the shock on some people's faces, we all kind of knew that Trump was coming back into power and what that meant for America, for global politics, for us. I mean, we don't know exactly what it means, but it's not great.
Yeah, we know it's not great.
We know it's not great.
We know there is no world in which
something happened with the light. Yeah. Okay. I think Trump's ghost is here.
Listening to us. That is very. You saw that, right?
I did not see that. I just heard the noises.
We are not afraid of your manipulations with the lights. We will continue speaking on US politics.
If you're trying to scare us, it's not working.
We say Trump because it's easy to say Trump because he is the president, and it's like his name has become a catchphrase kida for all things representing that political stream. But it's not just Trump. Trump has kind of become, unfortunately, kind of a centrist compared to, if you're looking at like, if you have the binary of like left and right and like blue and red, Trump as he was before and as he is currently is not the furthest right. Whereas when he was running and came into power the first time, he was the far right. Do you know what I mean?
I don't know, because to me, he's still extremely right. It's just that more people have now leaned right. Not only more people have leaned right, but the right has gone further right than it used to be within the context of American politics. So that Trump actually sometimes ends up like distancing himself for the ultra right theories and approaches or policies that people are trying to push. He sometimes will like distance himself from that to say like, no, I'm not that. I'm still like here. Because of him being president the first time around and what he was running on, the platform he was running on, and the things he allowed himself to say and the media covered and stuff, he normalized so much that would have been unthinkable, as we know, previously in American politics. And a lot of people would say that he's saying the thing that people are not saying out loud, and maybe that's a good thing, at least they're being exposed, which
that's not the point. Like whether that is true or not is debatable. But the point is he pushed things so far that now there's a lot more space to be like bigoted, racist, misogynist, very nationalistic, very like America first, America great mindset. And so now he is, I would not like he's centrist, like he's not middle center, but he is not the furthest right. And so the furthest right is other things.
Yeah, what is the furthest right? And do you think the furthest right will go so far as to then loop right around and become the furthest left at some point?
That's actually what they say about like the left in US politics now, that you can become so far, like the further left you go and the more liberal you get, you end up making a full circle back to the right.
Yes.
And I think the reason that's being said more on that side now is because in the last election cycle, even before Trump was elected, you saw a lot of Democratic politicians, speakers, whatever, congressmen, women, just people that consider themselves on that side of the political spectrum. You saw them kind of like denouncing the Democratic Party and claiming now that they are Republicans. And so that idea of like looping all the way back around is very popular now, but more from the left to the right, like looping from the far left and making your way to the Republican side, because it has happened for people that supported Trump and campaigned for him to be elected.
That's scary. So what are you saying? Are you saying that there's now even further right, like more extremist conservatives, extremist traditionalists that exist, and Trump is like avoiding going in that direction? Or are you saying that he, as maybe an individual, is like not as extreme, but the other extreme still exists?
One very clear example of that is Project 2025, which is kind of like a 100-page long manifesto / roadmap for an ultra-conservative American society, political dynamic, political environment, way of governance, cultural, like all the things. That is within that manifesto, it has the core of, it's very Handmaid's Tale, which we talked about in another episode. It's like the kind of the scariest, most, what we would consider, with people in our mindsets, what we would consider a very bigoted view of life and a very like white supremacist, very America first way of life. Something that heavily prioritizes and centers men and tries to control women and women's bodies and reproductive rights and health. As a way of forming like the idealistic society that's very nostalgic of decades-long ways of family structures and gender roles and political approaches to America, but also to the rest of the world.
Yeah, because, well, first of all, they can start within America, but it's already a very Christian nation with completely eroded boundaries between church and state. So they're kind of primed to take that, but it's like whether or not the American empire falls, the American machine is still all about exporting and imposing and like forcing their beliefs, their ethics, their desires onto other nations internationally.
Something like Project 2025 and as an example of that very far right, that when it was, this manifesto was kind of created, and this roadmap was created by a think tank.
The Heritage Foundation.
Yes, was created by the Heritage Foundation, that Trump is not particularly aligned with or affiliated with in like a very direct way. However, the many like experts and consultants and scholars and academics and politicians and whatever that contributed to different policies that make up this Project 2025 on a broad level have either been part of the Republican Party or have supported Trump in many ways, or are now, some of them, like members of the administration and being hired in different and important positions of power in the different branches of government. So while he was running and confronted with like to comment on Project 2025, he would often say, I don't know what it is, I never read it. That was his thing. Like, I didn't read it, I don't know what it is, I never read it, I have nothing to do with it. Malish da'wa, like it's not mine. So maybe that's true. I doubt that that's like fully true, but even if that's true, it doesn't mean that those policies have no space in his world, in his administration.
He wasn't condemning it. He wasn't saying, I have nothing to do with it, and what they say in it does not align with what I want or he would just say, I don't know, this is not my thing. But what surprises me sometimes is like this was presented very, very early on in the electoral, like this came out early 2024, even though Trump distanced himself, like there's very clear guidelines and roadmaps that are laid out that like, it's as if it was this handbook of in the first 100 days of presidency, this is what we want to see, and this is how we're going to do it. And day 1, we're going to do this, and day 2, we're going to do this. And here's a list of 10,000 people that want to work for the Trump administration, that are loyalists to this cause, that you can go on your firing spree and rehire from within this network. Like, it was this manual and this guideline that was very clear that I think he's following to a certain degree still now. But people are like blinded to the obvious.
Well, unfortunately, I think what people are grappling with now is that there's so many people that fully understand what they're voting for and are still voting for it. And I think that's what's shocking a lot of different segments of society, like within American politics and even just regular like people, is that they realize through this election, they realized like who they were friends with, who their neighbors are, who they were maybe married to, who their family members are, and what they truly, truly think on a deep core level, and the values that they hold, because they were fully aware of the plans that were coming within this election and with this administration clearly poised to win, which they did. And still they voted for him. So people were as a result of the elections, there was a lot of like disappointment within friend circles, within relationships, within marriages, within families. And it's because people couldn't believe that you would vote for that. And that excuse of like, you don't know what you're voting for, kind of dissipated this time around with Trump, because everything was being said very, very clearly. And a lot of the investigations into these policies and these roadmaps were being done early on, like you said, in the year. And still people voted for that. A majority of people still voted for that.
Yeah, I really struggle. I have American family that voted for Trump, and I have distant cousins that voted for Trump, and so much solidarity with him, even from Lebanese side of my family. Like, it's hurtful, and I won't let, politics necessarily like get in my family in that way, or like I'm too old to be confronting people and trying to fight with them on things that they feel very informed about, and they choose to make those decisions. But very often what I'm seeing is that even if what he's saying is horrendous, even if what he's planning seems scary, there's this still underlying belief of like, oh, he's just playing the government, like he's playing the White House game to get into power, but he's saying what needs to be said in order to win. It's not truly what he believes. It's not truly what's going to happen. I don't really believe he's going to do these things. He's just saying this crazy stuff about immigrants because he knows it's going to get him elected, but he's not actually going to go through with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily also are able to backtrack how it's going to affect them directly, because they maybe are making these decisions from some like delusional place of privilege that feels very disconnected from the people that are being targeted. So even if they do believe what he says about immigrants, they think it's about illegal immigrants exclusively coming from Mexico or like southern borders. And they don't necessarily think that it might expand to target other people who came fully legally or through asylum or from our part of the Middle East region,
Yeah, and I think the part that you can say maybe people don't understand are things like the details and repercussions of those policies. So something like, which was like a big thing when he was running, the idea of like imposing tariffs on like China and imposing tariffs on these people that are like exploiting American markets and American consumers and stuff, and kind of reaping the benefits of those like no tariffs and those like incentives to trade with America. So we were gonna like punish them by imposing tariffs and like make it work for us. And so people would just like spew the same things that were being said in these interviews and on these platforms. And then you would ask people in the street, like, do you know what a tariff is? Do you know how it affects you? Like, they don't realize that imposing a tariff on a country that you import from will mean higher cost of goods for you as a consumer.
Yeah.
So that drawing those connections and linkages between those, like, what seem like very broad policies that might not affect you and are going to like protect America, how they actually end up very quickly and almost immediately trickling down to like your wallet, basically. And so that's where they were playing on people's like ignorance or people's nationalistic sentiments a lot more, which is what you get in like very populist governments and regimes around the world, the kind of governments that America then wants to like free their people from. You know, like the kind of populist governments and regimes that America will say like, we're going to go to war to bring democracy to these countries that are under authoritarian or dictatorial leaderships. And that's kind of where people are seeing America now. So something like Project 2025, at the core of it, kind of is seeking to concentrate power in the hand of the administration, the president.
Yes.
And kind of do away as much as possible with the checks and balances that American government and American like structure is. So that's what makes democracy work, supposedly, for that country. But if you chip away at all like the ways that there are the connections between the different branches of government so that you concentrate power in one, then you get dictatorship, basically. And that's like at the core of Project 2025. How can you concentrate power and disenfranchise the different branches of government so that the only functional branch is the president?
Right, which is the executive branch.
Yeah.
There's legislative,
judicial, and executive.
Right. And executive. But judicial is not like the Supreme Court, or it is?
Yeah, partly, yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, of course.
So they literally dominate all three. They are their own checks and balances.
Yes, not only that, but there's also a concentration of power so that you are taking power away from like federal agencies, for example, by defunding them, so that they no longer function.
Right.
So that you are the last say.
Right.
Or you're implementing laws, for example, about you're not making it illegal anymore for federal agents or like federal workers and that work for America in different countries to bribe other government officials. Like that is illegal, to try and instill laws that make it not illegal, that make it okay. So then the way of doing business internationally becomes corrupt and fraudulent and all those things with bribery and things like that that are not the standard way of doing business in America.
He's already just like completely dismantled a lot of things and pushed a lot of people out, and it's going to get even scarier. But what do you think, the global and our regional community is going to feel from the implementation of things like Project 2025, for example?
I think we're already seeing very early on in his term in office, we're already seeing how he's reshaping the normal way of global politics. Like America's relationship with Europe, for example, is already deteriorating quickly because of his stance on Russia and Ukraine, because of the way that he wants to end that war by kind of striking a deal with Russia that doesn't take Ukraine into consideration. And that has not been the policy of previous administrations, and that's not the policy of the EU. And kind of not considering that relationship of like America and the EU against the world already kind of disintegrates that relationship, so that you're kind of shifting the world order where those are the people in power and they have to be aligned on how to approach different conflicts around the world. And his complete disregard for that is already putting those relationships into question. So then the US becomes like a rogue nation that can pretty much do, I mean, it already does whatever it wants, but there was some protection and some guarantees, and that there are other world leaders that have to be considered because of the different alliances and different interests. And if you approach global politics with like a zero fucks approach, so you don't care what anyone else thinks, you don't care how your relationships with other leaders and other countries are affected, and it's like America first and like screw everybody else, then you have a restructuring of the world order in a way that we don't know. It becomes very, very unpredictable, and it can become quickly volatile for anyone, really. Like, you don't know where it's going. But I think for us, and like what it's in ways that it's relevant for us right now, is at least like the ways that it can affect women and women's rights and women's bodily autonomy and reproductive rights, which is also very, very core to Project 2025, and it's wanting to further as much as possible restrict bodily autonomy for women and anything to do with women's rights or reproductive rights or women's health, even more than what we had seen before.
Yeah. I mean, just on the base level of like funding research.
Right.
Or funding medical testing or studies or clinical trials, you cannot publish a paper anymore that says certain words.
Yeah.
Or identifies gender or binaries or male or female, like that is just all paused now, for example. So if most of the research that helps educate or fund like medicinal development in other places in the world that's coming out of the US gets halted and they're not allowed to do research on women's health, which by the way is just like a very new development that people are even like had even started caring about studying women's health and including women's genes and women's cells in clinical trials of drugs and things like that. Like that's barely 20 years old at this point. So the fact that he's already coming in and stopping that research, when America was up until this point, I think one of like the leading voices globally that would kind of attack and guilt trip other nations into feeling like those nations were behind or like lacking in progress because of how they treated women. Now you're seeing this rollback, and it's a rollback to even like the knowledge, like book burning was what would happen 100 years ago. Now they're not burning books, they're just completely removing all existing papers, scholarly articles, funding for new trials, like anything that even mentions women's health, to make it completely inaccessible. And this is where like the fact that things can be centralized or like we depend on this very digital world of the internet, you know, becomes a huge issue, because it's as simple as the US just like closing access to JSTOR or something.
Quickly saw pages being taken offline and being like giving you an error message when you're trying to go search something about immigration, about some kind of like health issue, about different things related to gender. All of that stuff is like how quickly it can change is like a flip of a switch. It's like a page that's on the internet and now it's off the internet. Like you cannot access it anymore. And same goes for some policies. I mean, obviously a lot of the things that they're trying to do have to go through like a certain judicial process so that it reaches the Supreme Court. Like the idea of taking away birthright citizenship, which is core to the foundation of America, as it's like the glorified version of that story of like America's founding, and the bedrock of American society is the people that come to America. كل ده, like one of the core things in the Constitution, clearly written, is that if you are born in America, then you are an American citizen. You saw the reaction of Trump's win and the victory, not just as a political win, but it was very much seen as like somehow like men winning over women.
Yeah.
And there was this like trend, unfortunately, on social media where assholes basically were coming online and saying things like, your body, my choice. Boys were taunting little girls on the playground in schools. And it was this very like visceral reaction to the win from men and people who hate women. Yeah,
it was this convergence between what a few years ago was spoken of as like a very niche trend in online spaces of like toxic masculinity. It was this manosphere. It was very like Andrew Tate led. And as these men get more and more emboldened, you're actually seeing that what people considered a small community is much bigger than people originally anticipated. And what that community is tapping into in men is much, much, much broader. Some aspect of disempowerment, some aspect of loneliness, some aspect of fear. And instead of blaming what is to blame for all of those things, which is these existing patriarchal capitalistic structures that have unrealistic demands and expectations on the populace, they're now blaming women.
Yeah.
Who have like virtually no like legitimate power anyway in the system. And so you're blaming a community of people who don't have the power for having had power to make you feel the way that you feel at the core of it. And that there's not a finite amount of power or a finite amount of resources that are going to run out. If we actually like recognize humanity in others, all of these things can be achieved, and there's enough to go around, and that everybody deserves respect. There's no such thing as a finite amount of respect. Mm-hmm. There's no such thing as a finite amount of love and care that we can show another human being. But for some reason, they've completely like brainwashed the population into believing that the people with the least amount of power actually have the most amount of power. Illegal immigrants somehow are the ones in power that are taking away your jobs. That women somehow with no access to powerful seats are actually the ones who are putting your comfort and lifestyle at risk. And it's now this domino effect of like Trump getting into power has like also not just emboldened their local populace, but like multiple other countries that have been swinging right, like Brazil, like Hungary, like Germany. I feel like it's all of these dickheads just helping each other climb the ladder, when it was kind of like that, but it wasn't so extreme, and it wasn't necessarily like So just such like vile humans that were outwardly vile. Now what we're seeing is the nation's betterment is actually nowhere in the aspects that these leaders are considering. What they're considering is themselves and their positions of power on a global sphere, and they couldn't care less where their population goes. And people just aren't seeing it.
Yeah, but I think the problem of populist kind of rhetoric is that that's not obvious what you're saying, like that they're not obviously positioning themselves in a place where they are the ones that are going to reap the benefits and stuff. Like they run on very nationalistic, populist sentiment that supposedly centers the good of the nation. And that's where it gets really messy and fucked up. So even with talking about rolling back women's rights is somehow positioned and centered as something that somehow contributes to the betterment of society.
Yes.
Or to like the bringing back things that were cherished that are no longer there, and enforcing structures that have disintegrated because of liberal thought and because of leftist liberal thought and approaches to life and civil liberties and things like that. So it is positioned very much as something for the greater good, and it's very, very, very far for people to see that it's for the interests of these people and their money and their pockets and stuff. That's what gathers so much momentum around those movements.
Yeah. I want to, like, if it's all so hopeless, I'm curious to see, like, who currently has hope and who's taking action to kind of, like, combat it, but not even to address it, because if they're just disempowering and here and disempowering this community and disempowering community, how are these communities re-empowering themselves or holding on to their power or taking back their power, and what ways are they doing it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of processing still happening, and a lot of things are still shifting in a very quick way. And so I think the people that are still whether they're activists or advocacy groups or lawyers or like all of the different kinds, or just like people that can come together and mobilize, like there hasn't been a mobilization yet in a clear way. I think there's still a lot of processing happening and understanding, because things are moving very, very quickly. And so people are not able to keep up. And that's also like a strategy of that administration, is like what they call flooding the zone. And like you do a lot of stuff without, even if you know that it's going to be challenged in court or it's going to be shot down by the Constitution, by the, what's it called? The Supreme Court. you still do it anyway as a way of distracting people and getting them to think and look at different directions and different ways and things that are very real and very dangerous all at once. So you flood the courts, you flood the news, you flood the media, you flood people's thoughts, you flood the minds of activists and like what they can strategically focus on when. And that's like a very clear strategy of that administration. But one thing I thought was really interesting watching like from this side of the world was that I saw American women online adopting something that was happening more in Korea. So something called the 4B movement in Korea.
I heard of that.
I had never heard of it before this year. And I heard of it because people on like certain influencers and content creators were kind of adopting the core mindsets and ideologies of the 4B movement in Korea as a reaction to Trump's win and Trump's re-election coming into office, and as like a way of, as a reaction towards the people in their lives, particularly the men in their lives that voted for Trump. It's a more of a wider scale movement in Korea that originated around 2015, 2016. From what I understand, it was a reaction to very exploitative and very dangerous social and cultural structures and trends and happenings in Korean culture and Korean society that then kind of moved women to rebel and to kind of boycott so many different elements of life that make up what we would traditionally think of as like womenhood and women's relationship with men.
Yes.
So the 4 B's, it's in Korean, but the B's stand for words in the Korean language that in English are like basically loosely translate to like no marriage, no dating, no childbirth, and no brands or like / consumerism.
Yeah.
It's a reactionary movement to things that are happening in society. Exploitative dating cultures, very messed up structures when it comes to like women and their expectations, extremely high like levels of unpaid labor and unpaid care work taken on by women, and a really big burden of the way society functions placed on women in Korea. And so that was the reaction. It was kind of like, also I think inspired by, there is like a Greek maybe story.
Oh my God, I was just thinking about it. Yes, I was like, this reminds me, I think it's called Liz Estrada.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Maybe the pronunciation is off, but that's the right word.
I'm just bringing this back from like my college days and my friend doing some sort of inspired play from this, where essentially the women of society are unhappy with the fact that men are always going to war and distracted by fighting and war and killing. And so in order to get the men to stop warring, they come together and unify and decide that they're going to essentially do like they're going to boycott sex and physical affection and the day-to-day elements of like servitude or participation that women have in traditional gender expected relationships. And it works in the Greek thing. I don't know about Korea, in America, but in fictional story play worlds, it works, and the men get basically so sexually frustrated and upset that they end up like agreeing together to just stop fighting and stop going to war, and do as the women like wanted them. And I guess that also, that story plays deeply into the fears that the incels have that women are manipulating them into doing things. But what they're not seeing is that at least that's at the core, like for the good of society. War is not good for society. And so it's good for some societies that benefit off war, that have military industrial complexes that feed their entire economies and way of life. But in general, war is not good for society. Can you believe that if they, like that this 4B movement was inspired by Liz Estrada? That was a play written in like 411 BC in ancient Greece. And
here we are today.
One, women have not yet globally mobilized to do what is done to even test the theory, but it seems like it inspired movements thousands of years later in a completely different culture like Korea, which is now kind of making its way to the US.
Yeah, and I want to be clear that I haven't followed exactly like whether it was an initial reaction by women in America to kind of talk about the elements of 4B and how they're like adopting it in their life, and if that's faded away or not. And I'm not sure, but I think what was interesting was finding inspiration for, as an American woman in a Korean culture, which is so different from the workings of American society and culture and what it is branded as and how the world is meant to perceive it with all its like liberties and freedoms and stuff. But then getting to a place politically where you feel like you have to like seek inspiration for how to mobilize and how to boycott or rebel. Stereotypically, Americans wouldn't look outside in that way to figure out how to deal with like pretty basically tyrannical governance policies.
Yeah. Although Korea's had a moment in the last decade, really coming up and doing a lot of cross-cultural exchanges in terms of content and television shows and movies and music. And I mean, really, there's this big bond, especially in terms of the US public consumption of Korean culture. And why wouldn't it then expand to political movements also?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I think something else it shows is that clearly the workings of politics and society are heavily, in the most negative ways, they heavily center women and an attempt to control women's bodies and women's choices and women's paths in life, basically, as much as possible, because women are actually so powerful. And so when women kind of wake up and realize that that's what's being done to them and like seek to embody the power that they have as like very core elements of the functioning of society and the structure of families and the bedrock and the foundation of the way the world works, because of naturally what women's bodies can do, then you can tap into that power and figure out how to rebel and mobilize against systems that are seeking to oppress you or seeking to use you as a tool or a vehicle for just childbirth and upholding traditional family structures that don't necessarily benefit you in any way.
Yeah, but that power is exactly what people are scared of, that you've said this before, like that is why they seek to create legislative barriers for women or social structures that completely like suppress and oppress women. And that's globally, that's not just in the US, but what we're seeing, which is so interesting right now, is that they're like actively participating in it, whereas a lot of places where this type of repression and social oppression against women is in the world, those systems have been in place for a very, very, very long time. And so what people are mostly doing is trying to like break out of these existing cultural barriers or like legislative barriers and progressing out of it. But we're not seeing a lot of places going in the opposite direction. And so it's like a fascinating societal like study actually to be seeing how a country that was like at the forefront of progress and like, some sort of superiority complex in how they treat women and how they see gender and how they see sexuality, all of a sudden is like rolling back all of these things and implementing restrictions. It's a real-time reminder that it can happen, and it's not an outdated form of thinking that we've inherited and we're trying to break out of. It's very much a real-time form of thinking that can actually be implemented today.
Yeah, it can come back.
It can back.
Be brought back.
In our lifetimes.
Yeah.
Right? It's not that, it's one and done. Feminism was a wave in the 20s, and then again in the 60s, and then again in the 90s, and now again in the 2016s. And I would also say, it's something that we're going to be probably fighting for a very, very, very long time, that we have to keep holding our spot. But I don't think it's necessarily too far-fetched to say that this is a response of the 2016 neoliberal feminist movement that kind of came in as well.
What do you mean?
Everything is a pendulum, right? And so whenever you get a few steps towards progress, especially big radical wins, the idea of women openly speaking up against sexual harassment publicly and publicly shaming, shockingly, like these big figureheads, is going to create some sort of like outcry and the pendulum that went this way. It's a huge backlash, right? And especially the fact that like Trump, the Me Too movement erupted in the United States, and Trump is the embodiment of what the Me Too movement was fighting against. The fact that he's now come into power with this type of a backlash against women is not that surprising. Hopefully the pendulum will swing back at some point in the next 50 years.
50, yeah. I thought you were going to say like 5 years. I was like, no, ma'am. Yeah, 50, maybe. What differentiates one party from another? Like, what can you use as a political platform to really garner like mass appeal to people that have become so apathetic and ambivalent towards domestic politics and definitely towards international and global politics, no matter what's happening around the world? And so to gain back control and power, you have to initiate or kind of induce these big pendulum shifts that you're talking about. And a really easy way to do that is to go after and impinge on the rights of marginalized groups of people and marginalized communities. And that's why a lot of the time you see that the first people affected by these by this political rhetoric and these like pendulum shifts are women, people of color, immigrants / refugees, people in conflict zones, children. And when you attack or try to tweak the rights of those communities that are so hard won, and you have to really fight to win and gain those rights, what you're actually doing beyond rolling back those rights is you're disrupting like the very fabric that will make it much easier to control the larger population. So, for example, when you go after, in the US, when you go after different rights and laws, constitutional rights even, that have to do with immigration policies, those are based on rights that have been granted and guaranteed in the Constitution that don't necessarily say the word immigration.
Right.
They say other things that are supposed to ensure the equality between all people. And that's what you rely on to make it then a constitutional right in the legal framework to, for example, have immigration policies that are favorable to immigrants, or make sure that immigrants, even though their legal status may be not super official, but they still have the right to due process and they still have the right to a lawyer and they still have, those things are tied to rights that ensure the equality between all people. So when you start rolling those back, it's the first steps to implementing a much wider degree of inequality in all other areas of life.
Right, institutionalized inequality.
Yes.
That's openly recognized and worked on and spoken about.
First of all, those communities are easier to build a political platform on that puts them as the other, as the aliens, as the kind of dangerous element that you want to galvanize against and regain control against and restrict their movement, restrict their choices, restrict their whatever. It's much easier to villainize those groups of people that are already marginalized and gain populist power. But what that populist doesn't realize is the end, if you stretch that line out fully, the end result is that your liberties and your rights will also eventually and very quickly be affected.
Yeah.
And not just your economic mobility or your purchasing power, it's your own mobility and your own freedom of choice within your own life and in your own community that will eventually also be restricted. But it's just that the starting point for those political parties goes after these marginalized groups. And so you as a citizen, like as an American citizen living in, I don't know, fucking like a red state, Alabama or something, you don't think that that has anything to do with you.
Yeah.
But you will quickly realize that that has everything to do with you. You're just not as vulnerable as these other communities. And so you're harder to control, but that's actually the ultimate goal. It's not so much about women. I mean, it is very much about women in so many ways, but it's not just about women.
No, it's about just control. It's about power.
Control. It's about tyranny. It's about authoritarianism. It's about you being completely disenfranchised as a citizen, politically, economically, socially, culturally. And it's making people super fearful of each other. And that's the goal. Yeah. It's not really your, like, Trump coming into power is going to mean America first, therefore I'm going to be more prosperous. That's not really what's going to happen. And I think people are much more quickly than we realized starting to become more aware of that, but they see that it's too late.
Yeah, now it's too late. And in the face of all of this, in the face of this power grab and this, like, oppression that we're seeing now kind of blanket the country, I think why the 4B movement is so readily, like, adopted and was something that was taken on, surprisingly, by American women is because it actually involves boycotting and abstaining from things that the government has yet to touch on. For example, my choice to date, my choice to have sex, my choice to get married, the government cannot it can force who I'm allowed to marry and who I'm not, right? If they roll back a lot of these things, but it cannot force me to get married yet.
Right.
It can force me to have a child, but it cannot force me to have sex.
Right.
And so I will abstain from sex in order to avoid potentially getting pregnant in a way that I didn't want to, or at a time that I don't want to. I will abstain from dating because that's the first step in even getting close enough to somebody in order to have sex, in order to have a baby, or to get married. I'm abstaining from these institutions and these expectations that are placed upon women in society. Even if I'm heterosexual and I'm attracted to men, I'm abstaining from these acts because it's safer for me, number one, to just abstain. It's safer for me to create a life partnership with a platonic friend who's a woman, you know, than to commit to a man in this political climate. It becomes very, very dangerous. And that's the only thing that I think we feel, or women feel, that they can control sometimes. You know, BlackRock can own 9 of the 10 options I have in front of me. It's not a trick. I can choose not to do that and decolonize my perception and maybe buy things from abroad or hold back or make my own things. Homesteading and things like that are also responses to these
very true
things that are imposed.
Yeah. And a really good example based on what you said, and like it's not necessarily an adoption of the 4B movement, but it's kind of like inspired by it, and because of what's happening so quickly policy-wise, there is a very intentional, like they're seeking to roll back or cancel completely no-fault divorce. So as a no-fault divorce, meaning that as a woman, or I think mainly as a woman, but any part of the couple, you can file for divorce. You have the right to file for divorce without having like an evidence-backed reason that this marriage is harming you in some way.
Right.
Does that make sense? Yes. I don't know if I'm explaining it.
Yes.
It's like in Egypt, مثلا, it's the فكرة إنه الطلاق is like mostly in the man's hands, like he can verbally divorce you. بس الخلع, you can say you want out of this marriage without having to give like he cheated and I have pictures of him cheating, like that kind, or like he committed adultery and here is the evidence, like 3 people saw him do it, that kind of thing. So that's no-fault divorce, and it has been like a guaranteed right in America for so long that people have taken it for granted. And now that there is an attempt to roll that back, there was also, as part of the reaction of like, oh, we're also not going to have sex or get married or date or kida, there was also women calling on other women to, like, if you are in an unhappy marriage,
get divorced
and you've
now.
Been thinking about divorce, this is the time to do it, because pretty soon you might not be able to get out of this marriage. And just thinking of that is kind of crazy within like the context of what we usually see America and American society as. So that's another example of, exactly, like you have to move quickly. And people are also saying, like, if you don't have a passport, go get your passport, because you might not be able to. You might, if you want to leave, you might not be able to leave. And I know that some of that might be fear-mongering, but it's coming from a very, very, very real place, unfortunately.
But it also makes me just have a little bit of hope, and I want to end a very scary episode and a very scary conversation with that aspect, that there are ways, and there will always be ways to fight and to mobilize against tyranny and against these systems that seek to oppress you that are within your control. It's just about coming together to figure out what those are and what is realistically like within your realm of control, like dating. Yeah. I don't have to engage in that practice if I don't want to. I don't have to engage in that in a marriage, legally binding, if I don't want to. And you cannot force that yet.
Yeah, I think that's the fear. You cannot force that yet. Exactly. Well, I mean, I like that you like to find hope. I agree that people have to also now get creative with how they come together, with how they have those conversations online. And because a lot of this is now also, that's a whole other episode, but if we talk about TikTok and what's happening in the US with TikTok and stuff, a lot of those conversations are being censored in many ways online. And so the creativity that people are resorting to or being forced to have those conversations online in a way that can bring communities together and get people to think and create content and educate each other.
It feels like it is a race as to who can get ahead of who and who can mobilize faster. And Project 2025 was something that was literally worked on from the last time Trump was in office. They had 4 years of preparation for what they're currently putting into place. And I feel like the rest of us are just catching up to what it is. And so once that mobilization starts to really happen publicly, online, and I feel like the rest of us are just catching up to what it is. And so once that mobilization starts to really happen publicly, online, internationally, and people come together, it's going to constantly be this little rat race as to who's going to get ahead of who and who's going to sabotage who. And I hope you like this episode of Sage Takes Time. And make sure to like and share this with all your friends. Make sure that you're able to help us get around the algorithm that, as we said, may be trying to like shadow ban or quieten or suppress these conversations. If you can support Womena in any way, whether it's just by clicking that like button, commenting or saving, or if you can support through becoming a paid member on YouTube or over on Apple Podcasts, we really appreciate that. Consider it your little act of feminism for the day. Thank you so much for listening.